All right. So I am going to go ahead and start recording for the Nixon presidency. We're going to be flipping the 70s and 80s, kind of like we did last time. We have a very short amount of time to cover this. So you will be listening to these at home as kind of like homework, and then we'll be doing some activities that kind of look at it from a different angle in class. So we're going to talk about Nixon and his presidency specifically. We're really going to go all the way through the 1970s right now, and talking about Ford and Carter as well. So the next one that you need to worry about, come on, there we go, is going to be the election of 1968. So if you kind of rewind a little bit and think about 1964, LBJ wins very easily. Everyone's, yay, LBJ, you took over after Kennedy was assassinated, and we want to do something, we believe in what you're doing. And he's doing all these civil rights things, and people like Lester Maddox and Bull Connor are really kind of shining a light on kind of the ugly side of American life. And right, LBJ is promising kind of an answer for all of that. So in 1964, he's going to win pretty handily. Understand also that he's competing against a guy by the name of Barry Goldwater in 64. And really in 64, you have this, this is really where people say that we have the beginning of a conservative resurgence, that you have a conservative Republican Party that is redefining itself in 1964. Understand that, Republicans, conservatives, the big business kind of people that we think of, they had been very powerful during the Gilded Age, had been kind of influenced by progressivism. Then in the 1920s, they come in, and this is really kind of the peak of conservative republicanism. The chief business of the American people is business. And so in the 1920s, it's a huge, it's kind of a huge deal. And so then we have the Great Depression, and the Great Depression is going to usher in liberalism in the form of FDR and the New Deal. And throughout the New Deal and World War II, you're going to really see the strength of liberal policies. Now, Eisenhower obviously is a Republican, but he's not the same kind of Republican as Nixon. He's much more of kind of a hybrid. He's very moderate. He had some liberal policies he used. He kind of tightened the ship a little bit after the Great Depression was over, but he certainly continued aspects of kind of liberalism. And we certainly saw that beginning in 1957, he supports the Supreme Court. He supports civil rights. Okay. And so then you enter into Kennedy winning the election, which is a very close election. And he was certainly very much a moderate. Then he gets assassinated. LBJ comes in, and he's going to solve poverty. He's going to fight communism. He's going to do it all at once, right? The classic kind of overblown, over the top liberalism. And it ends up becoming kind of a mess, right? And obviously his handling of Vietnam was not well done. And of course, we talked about how people were very frustrated with that. And so that's creating some issues for LBJ. And so what we see is that he's by 1968, he can't run, right? I mean, he's eligible to run again, but he's not going to, because everybody's so upset about Vietnam, but they're also upset about his domestic policies, right? He's tried to, create this great society and solve poverty, which at first sounded great. But what's going to happen is that these great society programs are often put in place too quickly. There's not enough attention paid to what are the unintended consequences. And when they get put in place, they, unlike some of the New Deal programs that when they were put in place, if they didn't work, they just took them down. A lot of these great society programs get put in place and nobody wants to take them down. And they're just not put in place well. And this is one of the downsides of kind of liberalism, is that if policies are not carefully managed, they can really leave a bad taste in people's mouths. People can get very frustrated and very angry about them. And it can create a cycle of dependency. Hoover's concerns about, handouts weakening the American character is not coming out of nowhere. When people are given handouts, it does tend to affect their willingness to take advantage. And you guys see it every day when you have people in your classrooms that have access to free education that there are places all over the world that people would just, they're amazed that you can go to school, that you can learn, and that you can learn with a degree of comfort and with the degree of technology that you have. And sadly, there are many people that don't appreciate it. Right. And so that's that, think of that as kind of a microcosm of what the Great Society programs did. So 1968, Nixon is going to come in, and he's going to win very handily. Of course, Robert Kennedy's assassinated in 68, as is Martin Luther King. And so you really kind of, the Democratic liberal side is just kind of dumbfounded at this point. And so Nixon's going to win. He's going to start the process of Vietnamization and, massive air bombings to kind of get us out of Vietnam. Part of what we'll see is that part of the ending of Vietnam is going to be tangled up with his Watergate scandal. And that part of why I think that the withdrawal from Vietnam happens exactly kind of in the messy way that it does is due in part to Watergate and the domestic pressures Nixon is facing. But certainly we see by 73, we've issued a ceasefire. By 75, South Vietnam has been taken over by North Vietnam. You've had the effect of the 26th Amendment and that kind of thing. Now, understand that Nixon, for all that he is a conservative, and he is absolutely that, he has some policies like the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Environmentalism really kind of kicks off. We talked about Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in the 1960s, raising awareness. People began to really see the impact of massive industrialization that had been taking place. If you remember going back to World War II and how this massive mobilization had changed everything. So you definitely see that. And so he's going to create the EPA. We're going to have the Endangered Species Act, trying to protect certain species from being extinct. And this is going to happen under Nixon, which seems like kind of a crazy liberal thing to do. But you have to understand that we're still in this period where conservatism is redefining itself. And at this point, environmentalism is seen as kind of a universal issue, which is something that I think we're starting to see it trend back to. There for about 20 years, it was seen as a very liberal concern. And I think now with climate change, we're starting to see it kind of moving back to more of a universal issue. And so Nixon's going to come in. He's going to kind of have some of these things like the EPA and the Endangered Species Act. We're going to see him start to shift the Great Society programs away from all this federal government control to local and state control, which doesn't really dismantle the programs, but it is designed to create more efficiency and more response and more kind of reaction to keep people from abusing the system. It's not really a negative thing. It's just a different approach to the Great Society programs, but it does explain why there's some states that seem to have had much more generous programs than other states. And that was particularly true in the Deep South. And he's also the president when we land somebody on the moon. And, of course, he doesn't really have a whole lot. I mean, it wasn't under him that these policies take place. He takes the oath of office in January of 69. And by August of 69, we've got somebody on the moon. So a lot of this stuff was already in place. But I still think it's important to kind of realize he was the guy in charge. And we've already talked about how other civil rights groups really began to say, we want social equality too. And they've seen how you define social equality in the 1960s with the right to vote and with the right to protest. And then we're starting to have these conversations about economic opportunity, things that we talked about with affirmative action in Title IX. And how do we take, if social equality is contingent upon access to education and access to earn money, how do we kind of balance those issues out? And so this is kind of where these programs come in. And it's really under Nixon that we see all of this kind of brewing up. So just to understand that we've got they kind of start to have this attitude going into the 1970s of kind of a fatigue, like, oh gosh, everybody's unhappy with something, right? The best way I can think of it is if you think about political correctness now and how some people feel about that. Um, so I definitely think that that you start to see um, kind of a frustrated American public in a lot of ways, because you have so many groups that are demanding more. Because kind of like you opened that box of social equality, and now we realize that for over 100 years we haven't been giving people social equality, and many people are really kind of upset about that. Um, Notice here that one of the things that, and Barry Goldwater had tried to do this in '64, but he doesn't quite connect, because he was very much an advocate of using nuclear war. And LBJ did his famous daisy ad for the little girl picking the daisy flowers and the nuclear bomb going off in the background. And so people were still kind of afraid of nuclear war. I remember that wasn't that far from the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? But by 1968, you've got a slightly different kind of attitude. And part of what Nixon does that's so brilliant, and this is part of kind of this conservative redefining and conservative resurgence, is that instead of focusing on military strength and tackling communism, he wants to take a different attitude with foreign policy. And instead, he turns to, you know what, I'm going to get some more conservative Supreme Court justices on there, that on the Supreme Court, because we've had this activist Supreme Court for a while, and we see what they've done, and they opened this box of social equality, and now we've got all these different groups that are angry. So I'm going to start focusing on more conservative domestic issues. So one of the ways that the conservative resurgence begins to redefine itself as, rather than being kind of what we would call hawkish, which is, we're going to go fight people and we've got the best military and, all this kind of stuff, rather than using that kind of Barry Goldwater tactic of I'm going to be strong on communism, you really see Nixon advocating for a different type of containment policy, which we'll get to here in a second, and instead focusing on domestic security and domestic peace. And you know what? We're going to get a handle on the social equality stuff by getting some justices in there that aren't quite so crazy liberal. And we're going to change the way the Supreme Court works. And, we're going to get control over lawbreakers and protesters. And I'm going to be a law and order kind of president. So there's a heavy focus on kind of domestic policy, domestic peace. And he's definitely going to kind of take that attitude, and understanding that's going to help you kind of get a little bit why Watergate happens, because he's definitely going to be a fan of using the federal government to watch the American people and keep an eye on people who are breaking the law or protesting or anything like that. And it's under him that we have what they call new federalism, which is this new kind of redefining the relationship of the federal government with states and local entities. Again, remember, this is a conservative resurgence, a conservative redefining. And Barry Goldberg, that's the show, Barry Goldwater had attempted to do that with his talk about nuclear attacks, but he really, he didn't connect with people. It wasn't the right time for this. But now in 68, 70, 72, people are so tired of hearing everyone complain about the American society that they're ready for somebody to kind of come in and clean up the house and get the house organized and that kind of thing. This shows you Nixon in the Oval Office right there, surrounded by his aides. One of the interesting things about Nixon is he had an incredibly loyal group of people around him. And for all that, Nixon's a fascinating character for historians, because there's parts of him that are really kind of yucky and reprehensible. And you think, oh my gosh, I can't believe a president would do that. And then there's other parts of him that are really kind of admirable. And he's certainly incredibly loyal to his people. And that makes it very interesting. I mentioned before that his foreign policy takes a new kind of tactic, as opposed to, we're going to be tough on communism, which really interestingly started with the Democrats, with Kennedy, who was like, I'm not going to look soft on communism. And LBJ, who was even more so, we're not going to be soft on communism. And he really kind of interestingly takes a different attitude. You see on here the ping pong team, right? If I have any Forrest Gump fans out there, there's the, kind of the segment in that movie where he's playing ping pong and he travels to China and all this kind of stuff. That's based on a real occurrence. There really was an American ping pong team that travels to China and gets all this attention. And, it's kind of seen as the beginning of kind of this thawing of a relationship. Another name you need to be familiar with is Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was a National Security Council advisor. He was very important in kind of helping Nixon navigate the end of Vietnam, navigate the relationship with China, navigate foreign policy. And he was very much the kind of person that believed that what you did was you created a relationship with people and then relied on economic influence to help contain communism. And this is where we get to this idea of engagement and negotiation. That if we keep using our military, if we're spending all this military stuff and we're always at high alert, it creates a fatigue with the American public, and it creates an economic fatigue, because when you're spending money for military goods, you're not building infrastructure. The way I always describe it is if in your personal budget you're using credit cards to go out to eat, you're not really getting anything out of it, right? You're getting a temporary easing of discomfort, and that's it, right? But if instead you use your credit to, say, get an education, right, what you're doing is you're creating a personal infrastructure that will enable you to make more money later on. And so it's very much the same kind of concept with military spending, that when you take military spending, it may solve things temporarily, and it definitely stimulates economic growth temporarily. It makes us feel better about ourselves militarily and as far as security. But long term, it kind of creates a suck that just kind of pulls resources, and it tends to contribute to economic problems. So one of the things that you see Nixon, in part with advice of Kissinger, is saying, we've got to stop this cycle of the military stuff, right? And you certainly kind of saw shades of that when he comes in and he starts relying on heavy bombing to get us out of Vietnam, as opposed to using soldiers, right? And you start to see kind of the American preference for using technology to fight our battles rather than actual men on the ground. And so they start focusing on reaching out to people. And one of the things that will happen that Kissinger's very well known for is recognizing that the communists in the Soviet Union and the communists in China actually didn't really like each other that much. As long as they had a common enemy in the United States, they were kind of on the same side. But what Kissinger realized was that if we could reach out and be friendly with them, right, we could actually create kind of a wedge between the two of them. And that would be good for us. And so you kind of see this different attitude about how to engage with communist countries. And it's incredibly powerful, and it really does work. In fact, for all that Ronald Reagan gets a lot of credit for bringing about the end of communism, what you see is that it's Nixon. And his kind of changing of the relationship with China and with the Soviet Union that really actually kind of begins this, right? Begins kind of this level of engagement on an economic level that's really kind of the strength of the American system, which if you go back to the long telegram that we talked about in 1948, that's what he said, was economically they couldn't sustain themselves. And we kept challenging them militarily. And, that would be like, going up to somebody who's big and strong, and you're big and strong, and you're going to fight each other. Well, you're just going to pummel each other into bits. But if you find a different way to challenge each other, let's play a game of Jeopardy or something like that, then that's a new way, and you can find new strengths and new ways to beat each other. So we're going to see a shift in containment of communism away from that military engagement towards this kind of economic engagement, this negotiation. Let's talk out our differences. We have the withdrawal from Vietnam. Détente is another word that you want to know. Détente is a French word meaning kind of this cooling off, this easing of tensions, right? So we have this big summit with the Soviet Union. There's this famous kind of clip where, then I'd have to look it up, but where Nixon and Khrushchev are basically showing like model kitchens or whatever. And what do they go to, the toaster conference or something like that? Anyways, you have Nixon and they're bragging about how great American kitchens are. It's really, it's one of those kind of silly moments in history. But this is kind of part of what we see happening. Nixon and Khrushchev talking, and they actually aren't sure that they like each other very much. There's some interesting kind of side notes there. Most importantly, you have Nixon actually traveling to China, which is a first, right? Because remember, the U.S. had this very difficult relationship with China going all the way back to when the Chinese started coming in the 1850s, right? And then we have the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and then then we really had nothing to do with China until all of a sudden the Japanese invade, and then we're helping the nationalists, and they're corrupt, and then the communists come in, and then we, we're not going to let them sit on the United Nations Security Council. And so this is huge, right? So we're having this visit to China at the same time that we're having détente with the Soviet Union. And this is where our economic relationship with China begins. And if you notice, this is when China really begins to, while they're still a communist country, they're still a single party country, and I'm not suggesting that they don't have human rights issues, but from an economic perspective, this is when China really begins to kind of join the Western world a little bit. Very, very important period here in the early 1970s, and it's due to Nixon and it's due to Kissinger. We do see that we have SALT I, and a few years later, there's what we call SALT II. Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty is what SALT stands for. SALT I limits one type of nuclear arms and increases trade. SALT II does kind of a different variation of that. SALT I and SALT II treaties were meant to kind of de-escalate nuclear warfare. Again, Nixon learned from Barry Goldwater that American public didn't like nuclear weapons that much. And so he's trying to restrict those a little bit. And so the SALT I and SALT II treaties are a big part of, again, this kind of negotiation that we're having and that sort of thing. And you can see here some pictures from Nixon's visit to China and the ping pong team and that kind of thing. Nixon going into, so he wins 68. By 72, we're in another election year. Again, Nixon was kind of an interesting personality. He had an incredibly loyal group of insiders. But outside of those insiders, he had been very, he felt like had been persecuted, I guess is the best way to say that, and he'd had this long political career going back to the 1940s. He had participated with the House Un-American Activities Committee. He comes from California, which, if you know anything about California, has really kind of two faces to it. You've got kind of the far left, liberal, hippie, artistic kind of, environment, and then you've got another very conservative side. And so California is a very kind of polarized political environment. And so Nixon, that's where he comes from. And so he definitely had kind of a paranoia, I guess you could say, about people being out to get him, about people looking for him to trip up. Famously, Eisenhower didn't like him, and here he'd been his vice president, and so he had some resentment, even about some of the inner Republicans, and so he definitely was very secretive, taped every single conversation that he had hours and hours and hours of video, of tape recorded conversations that he used on the phone. And of course, he's in this period of the late 60s and early 70s where you have all these protests, all these movements. You'd had the Pentagon Papers with Daniel Ellsberg, if you remember back to Vietnam, when he releases this in the 1970s, kind of documenting the State Department research over how we got involved in Vietnam and how all of that had happened. And you definitely see that that kind of makes Nixon very paranoid that people are he's got moles within his administration. And of course, in 1972, you've got the Kent State shootings, you've got kind of the increase of the Christmas bombings. And so he's facing kind of a challenge in 72. And because he's not super well liked, this is when you kind of see him engaging in some unethical practices. Now, understand this is about the time that he appeals to the silent majority, that he says, there's a group of Americans that don't protest, that don't scream and holler, that are happy with what I'm doing, that they want peace and order, they want things to calm down, that they understand what I'm trying to do in Vietnam. And so, and he makes a successful appeal in 72, but it's not an easy election. And one of the things that the Republican National Committee engages in is a lot of spying. And there's going to be this break-in at the Democratic National Headquarters. And they spread false reports and lots of other kind of dirty, underhanded tricks. Now, again, this is part of how Nixon is, right? I mean, he grows up in an environment where he's had to fight for everything he had. And he really faced a great deal of challenges, politically. But nonetheless, it's with him that you have this Watergate break-in. Now, the Republican National Committee, I mean, the way politics works is typically the sitting president is not the head of his party's committee, right? So it's that Nixon would have ordered the break-in at Watergate is unlikely. He probably certainly said, by any means necessary, get me the information I need to defeat McGovern. Okay, that probably happened. But then you have a group of guys at the Republican National Committee that said, hey, let's go break in at the Watergate and we'll spy through some of the Democratic National Committee's files, and we'll get some of their donors and all this kind of stuff, see if we can dig up some dirt. So they do this and they get arrested. They get caught, right? And at first it's like nothing. Like first everyone's like, oh, gee, somebody broke into the Democratic headquarters. Not a big deal. The 1972 election happens. Nixon wins. No big deal. But then what will happen after the 1972 election is these guys start to, the trials come up, right? And what you start to see is that Nixon uses his power of the president to, first off, try to help these guys get out of trouble. And then when it comes out that he's trying to help get them out of trouble, he uses his power of the president to basically hide what he's doing, right? And he destroys, tape recorded conversations and all this kind of stuff. So, and he claims it's executive privilege, that the president has a right to have a certain degree of privacy and a certain degree of secrecy, and that the president is allowed to bend the rules a little bit and all that kind of stuff. Now, keep in mind that the president takes an oath of office to uphold the Constitution, okay? That's kind of a pesky point there. And kind of using this kind of bribery, using his power to intimidate people, to cover things up, to destroy documents, destroy that's kind of a problem. Okay. And so you're going to start to see that this gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And Washington Post kind of breaks the story, and everyone gets very concerned with the investigations into Watergate, the testimony and all that begin to reveal the connections. You also see the vice president, Spiro Agnew, gets indicted for bribery, and so he has to step down. So by 1973, Nixon's administration is a mess, right? His vice president has stepped down because he was being charged with bribery. Gerald Ford comes in as vice president, not having been elected to that job. Nixon is facing all these kinds of challenges. It's coming out that he even if he didn't know what was happening when they broke into the Watergate, he certainly knew about it after the fact, and then, like I said, used his office to kind of support that, and destroyed evidence. And guys, this is part of what Hillary Clinton's getting in trouble for, which is that, can somebody, whether you're Secretary of State or whether you're the president, can you claim a right to privacy? If you're using, and part of what Hillary Clinton's doing is saying, well, this was my private email server, and so it wasn't, and there weren't some of the rules that are now in place about controlling the public's access to government officials' private stuff. Some of those weren't in place yet, and so she's kind of got this weird kind of gray area. It could still get her in trouble because, in some ways what she did with deleting the emails is a little bit similar to what Nixon did with deleting the tape recorded conversations. I think the big difference is that Nixon was clearly using the Oval Office. He was using the White House telephones. He was using government equipment, and this is a federal investigation. Whereas with Hillary Clinton, it's a little different in that these were personal emails. Some of them, of course, we'll never know exactly to what extent. So there's some problems with that, but just kind of understand there's a connection there in case you see that popping up over the next few months. And so you definitely see that in 1974, Nixon will resign from the office. because he's facing, he can't get anything done. I mean, he's a complete lame duck at this point. And he's facing charges. And if he, so he steps down. And what you're going to have is you're going to have kind of some legislation to kind of protect the election process. So we have some more interest in that, because it really kind of points to some of the problems that people have. This shows you the Watergate Hotel right there. And where the break-in happened. It was kind of an office complex as well as a hotel, and that sort of thing. Part of what we see emerging in the 1970s is going to be inflation. This is again kind of we're coming up into 74, which is going to be a midterm election year. And Nixon's resigning. But prior to that, we'd started to see economic problems emerging. And a lot of that goes back to the Great Society programs, the massive spending that was happening there, and the massive spending for Vietnam, for the military equipment. And there was just a lot of spending going on, right? And so we have some interest rate issues. We're not having any new tax dollars. And so we're starting to have a major rise in the cost of goods, and yet wages are stagnating, okay? We also see that there's lots of global competition over oil. We'll talk about OPEC here in a second. And so we have, raw materials are getting harder to find because we've been industrialized so much. Oil is, the U.S. had really kind of phased away from getting oil domestically and turned to the Middle East to get oil, going back to the 1950s, which we'll talk about that when we talk about the history of the Middle East. And so as these oil-producing countries begin to realize they have some power there, they begin to flex that power, and that's going to begin to hurt the American economy. We're also going to see a decline of manufacturing. And you're going to have, as manufacturing begins to fall away because of raw materials and profit margins and wages and stuff like that, people lose their job, the economy starts to freeze up, and we have what we call stagflation, which is a stagnated economic system. There's no economic growth, except prices are going up, right? Price of milk, price of gas, price of everything. Wages are staying still. There's not new jobs being created. So you would think that prices should fall because consumption shouldn't be there, but that's not the case. The prices are continuing to rise. And because this is kind of a unique economic circumstance, nobody's really sure exactly what to do, right? If we increase taxes, is that going to pull too much money out of the economy and collapse the economy? Will that help lower prices? Do we increase spending, except we've already been spending a lot? What's that going to do? And what do we do about military spending? So there's lots of big questions going on here. About how to respond to that. And we'll talk about how in the 70s, we kind of have this idea of we're going to increase taxes. We're going to try to kind of or reorganize things spending wise. And then when you get into the 1980s, we'll talk about how Reagan approaches his economic growth. And we'll talk about Reaganomics specifically. The other big thing I want to point out in the 1970s is that manufacturing will move to the South. This is the Rust Belt. This is the area in the Midwest and the North that had been a manufacturing center for really about 100 years, right? And it has begun to decline. Part of it's the winters were colder. And part of it is the creation of air conditioning down south makes living down south much more comfortable. The World War II spending had kind of created some infrastructure in the South that could support industrial development. And what's going to happen is that people are going to say, you know what, I'm tired of living up north where it snows and it's icy and it's, and we have all these factories and all this pollution. Let's move down south. And so we have this kind of migration of people that happens in the 1970s. And we call that, moving to the Sun Belt. So you'll want to be sure you kind of understand that concept. And that really part of what drives this are the economic circumstances, the benefit of air conditioning. You're going to have, people just suddenly having a desire to live in a better area. And different types of manufacturing sectors being created, and also some, ability to gain access to, low wage workers and that kind of thing is going to make a very big difference. Here's a couple of cartoons about stagflation, and kind of this idea that we don't know what to do about it. We don't know how to fix it. If we feed it, if we starve it, nothing seems to happen. And that it's really kind of this mixed bag. And I think I'm going to stop here because I've been talking for a little bit, and we will pick up with OPEC in the next section.